Alright folks, buckle up because we're diving headfirst into the Renaissance. And who better to kick things off with than Leonardo da Vinci? Born on April 15, 1452, in a quaint Tuscan hill town called Vinci, yes, like the name on his birth certificate, Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, di Ser Piero, because his dad was a notary named Piero, not because Leonardo was some nobleman's kid, despite what the name might imply. His mom? A mysterious woman named Caterina, who was likely a local peasant, or perhaps a slave from the Middle East. Talk about starting life with a soap opera twist. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Leonardo was illegitimate. In 15th century Italy, this wasn't exactly a ticket to the high life. But while some folks might have seen this as a setback, for Leonardo, it was like winning the genetic lottery of creativity. Being illegitimate meant no fancy formal education, which sounds like a disadvantage until you realize he had the freedom to learn from the world around him, rather than being boxed in by the rigid curriculum of the time. Picture a young Leonardo, eyes wide open, soaking up everything from the way birds flew to the mechanics of watermills. His classroom was the world, and his teachers were curiosity and observation. Fast forward to his teen years, and Leonardo was shipped off to Florence to become an apprentice under the watchful eye of Andrea del Verrocchio, a man whose reputation was as big as his workshop. Verrocchio wasn't just your average artist. He was the Renaissance equivalent of a multi-hyphenate influencer. In his studio, art met engineering, sculpture danced with metalwork, and young Leonardo fell head over heels for it all. Now, about those doodles. Leonardo had this habit of sketching things that seemed straight out of a sci-fi movie. Imagine a helicopter centuries before the Wright brothers even considered defying gravity, or an armored vehicle that looks suspiciously like a tank, albeit with a few design flaws, like cannons pointing at the operator. Oops. While most of these ideas never took to the skies or the battlefield, they were the seeds of innovation. Leonardo was less about immediate practicality and more about the audacity of imagination. He was like the kid in class who never stopped asking, "But what if?" But let's not get too misty-eyed about young Leonardo. He wasn't just a dreamy-eyed inventor, he was human after all. And like many of us, he had his quirks. For instance, he was known to buy caged birds just to set them free. A lovely gesture, sure, but it also hints at a man who saw potential and beauty in freedom, whether it was his own or that of a tiny feathered friend. Leonardo's time in Verrocchio's workshop was essentially the artist's version of a reality TV show, complete with drama, competition, and the occasional masterpiece. One famous anecdote tells of a painting they worked on together called The Baptism of Christ. Legend has it that Leonardo painted an angel so exquisitely that Verrocchio, upon seeing it, decided never to paint again. Whether or not this is true is up for debate, but it sure makes for a compelling narrative about the student surpassing the master. Yet, behind the myth of the genius was a man with a practical side. Leonardo's notebooks weren't just filled with fantastical machines and anatomical sketches. They also contain grocery lists and to-do notes, because even visionaries need to remember to buy cheese. These notebooks, filled with over 13,000 pages of ideas, observations, and scribbles, are like the most epic Pinterest board ever, only with more Latin and mirror writing. So, why does all this matter? Well, Leonardo's early life is a reminder that genius doesn't follow a straight path. It zigzags, takes detours, and sometimes lands in places no one expected. His upbringing in Vinci and subsequent move to Florence were pivotal in shaping not just an artist, but a thinker whose ideas would echo through centuries. The Renaissance was a time of rebirth, not just for Europe, but for the individual, and Leonardo da Vinci was its poster child, not because he was perfect, but because he was perpetually curious. He wasn't just a product of his time, he was a creator of it, sketching the future one fantastical doodle at a time. So, we've sketched the broad strokes of Leonardo da Vinci's early life, but let's zoom in now on the messy, vibrant chaos that was his professional career in Florence and Milan. Picture this. Leonardo, by now a seasoned artist and thinker, struts into Florence in the late 1470s, a city practically vibrating with the hum of artistic genius and political intrigue. It's like a Renaissance rock concert where the artists are the headliners and the Medici family is the backstage pass everyone wants. But fame in Florence wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Leonardo was up against heavyweights like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio, so carving out a niche was like trying to paint the Sistine Chapel with a toothbrush. Despite the competition, he managed to snag some juicy commissions. Here's a fun tidbit. The monks of San Donato a Scopeto hired him for an altarpiece in 1481. Spoiler alert, he never finished it. And this, dear listeners, sets the tone for one of Leonardo's lifelong habits, an uncanny ability to start things with gusto and leave them hanging like an awkward pause in conversation. But hey, who are we to judge? Leonardo's procrastination wasn't just a case of, I'll do it tomorrow. His brain was a whirlwind of ideas, and sometimes the next big thing was just too tempting to resist. This tendency becomes glaringly obvious when he packs up his brushes and heads to Milan around 1402, like an artist on tour, leaving unfinished projects in his wake. Enter Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, a man whose nickname Il Moro might sound like a suave stage name, but he was as ruthless as they come. Ludovico was the kind of guy who wanted to cement his legacy with grandiose projects, and who better to hire than the man who dreamed of flying machines and underwater breathing devices. Leonardo was offered a gig in Milan to build a colossal bronze horse, a tribute to Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. Imagine a 24-foot tall behemoth that would have been the Renaissance equivalent of the Statue of Liberty. In true Leonardo fashion, he threw himself into the project with a fervour matched only by his knack for leaving things half done. Here's where the plot thickens. The horse was never completed. Why, you ask? Well, assembling 80 tons of bronze was no small feat. And just as Leonardo was gearing up for the big pour, the French decided to invade Milan in 1499, repurposing the bronze for cannonballs instead. Nothing says artistic vision like being thwarted by the necessities of war. It's a classic tale of ambition colliding with reality, reminding us that even the greatest minds can be sidelined by the harsh pragmatism of politics and economics. Despite the setbacks, Leonardo's time in Milan wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. He thrived in Ludovico's court, surrounded by thinkers and creatives who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. It was here that he painted The Last Supper, a piece that would become one of art history's most iconic works. But let's not romanticize it too much. This masterpiece was painted on a wall that wasn't exactly primed for greatness. Leonardo, ever the innovator, experimented with a technique that didn't quite stand the test of time. Fast forward to today, and we're left with a masterpiece that's had more touch-ups than a faded celebrity. Yet, Leonardo's brilliance wasn't confined to canvases and frescoes. He was a polymath in the truest sense, dipping his toes into engineering, anatomy, and even urban planning. His notebooks reveal a mind that was constantly ticking, sketching designs for everything from water pumps to musical instruments. And let's not forget his anatomical studies, detailed drawings that would make modern medical illustrators weep with envy. These weren't just idle scribbles, they were the groundwork for a future where art and science danced a delicate waltz. Leonardo's quirks extended beyond his work. He was known for his eccentric habits, like being a strict vegetarian, which in 15th century Italy was about as common as gluten-free pasta. He also had a penchant for wearing pink, a colour choice that likely raised a few Renaissance eyebrows. And then there was his love of animals, which saw him adopting a menagerie of pets, including a lizard he supposedly turned into a mini-dragon with a little creative DIY. It's details like these that remind us. Leonardo was not just a genius, but a man whose life was as colourful as his paintings. So, why does any of this matter? Because Leonardo's story is a tapestry of triumphs and flops, a blend of ambition and procrastination, reminding us that genius is often a chaotic, unpredictable force. His time in Florence and Milan was a period of exploration and experimentation, both within his art and his broader inventions. While the 24-foot horse never trotted into reality, it symbolizes the boldness of Leonardo's vision, a vision that dared to dream big even when practicality said otherwise. And this, dear friends, is where we leave Leonardo for now, halfway through his life's journey, with unfinished projects and extraordinary achievements scattered like breadcrumbs. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the enigma that is Leonardo da Vinci, a man whose legacy remains as vivid and complex as the Renaissance itself. And speaking of scattered breadcrumbs, Leonardo's insatiable curiosity was about to lead him down some of the most fascinating and occasionally gruesome paths of his career. This is where our story takes a sharp left turn into the world of science, where Leonardo's brain was constantly buzzing with questions about how the world worked. Imagine him, not merely satisfied with painting the outer beauty of life, but driven to peel back the layers and uncover the mysteries beneath. Let's start with his anatomical studies. Now, before you picture modern medical labs, think of Leonardo slipping into the shadowy corners of hospitals and morgues, armed with permission slips from a few understanding monks to dissect cadavers. This was not a pastime for the faint-hearted folks. This was a man so committed to understanding the human body that he braved the stench and stigma of death to sketch muscles, bones, and organs with a precision that would make a surgeon weep with envy. The result? Over 240 detailed drawings, with each sketched line whispering tales of sinews and tendons like an anatomical bard. Now, why was he doing this in the first place? Well, the Renaissance was a time when the Church's authority on the human body was as unquestioned as a modern-day GPS. Often wrong, but no one dared argue. Leonardo, in his infinite curiosity, wasn't buying it. He wanted first-hand data, and let's face it, the man was as stubborn as a mule with a purpose. His dissections were not just scientific inquiries, they were acts of rebellion, tiny scalpel-wielding revolutions against the status quo. And then there was his obsession with water. To Leonardo, water was not just something you drank or bathed in, it was the lifeblood of the planet, an untamed force of nature. He studied its movement with the dedication of a poet trying to capture the essence of love. His notebooks reveal an array of water-related inventions, from hydraulic pumps to machines for testing water currents. Leonardo was essentially trying to tame Poseidon with his sketches. One of his more ambitious ideas involved diverting the Arno River to flood Pisa, a plan to thwart the city's economic power during the Florentine-Pisan Wars. Alas, this scheme remained as fluid as water itself, evaporating into the realm of unrealized dreams. Then there's Flightman's oldest, and to Leonardo, most tantalizing obsession. Picture him watching birds soar, his mind racing to decode the secrets of their effortless grace. His notebooks from the 1480s and 1490s are filled with sketches of flying machines, the most famous being the ornithopter, designed to mimic the flapping of wings. While it never got off the ground, literally, it was a testament to Leonardo's audacity to dream. It's as if he stood on the brink of the impossible and said, why not? Sure, his contraptions were about as airworthy as a brick, but they laid the foundation for future aviators to take flight. Now, let's wrap our minds around those cryptic notebooks of his. If you've ever seen Leonardo's handwritten notes, you might have noticed something peculiar, the man wrote backward. Was he some kind of Renaissance cryptographer hiding his secrets from prying eyes? Not quite. While some conspiracy theorists might want to believe it was Da Vinci Code 1.0, the reality is more mundane. Leonardo was left-handed, and writing backward prevented his hand from smudging the ink, practicality over paranoia. It's a bit like discovering your favorite magician's trick is just sleight of hand, not real magic. Yet, it adds a layer of mystery to the man who seemed to have a direct line to the muses. But why does any of this matter? Because Leonardo's pursuits in science and engineering were the seeds of modern innovation. He was a bridge between art and science, a man who saw no barriers between the two. His work was a testament to the power of curiosity, a reminder that the world is a vast, unexplored canvas waiting for someone to pick up the brush, or in Leonardo's case, the scalpel and quill. His legacy in the sciences is a reminder that genius is often about asking the right questions, even if the answers are centuries away. And as we close this chapter of Leonardo's story, we're left with a man whose life was a constant dance between the known and the unknown, the possible and the impossible. His journey was far from over, and his path continued to be as unpredictable as his inventions. So, stay with us as we dive deeper into the life of a man who refused to be boxed in by the limitations of his time, a pioneer whose legacy still echoes in the halls of science and art. There's more to uncover, more breadcrumbs to follow, as we continue the saga of Leonardo da Vinci. As Leonardo's insatiable curiosity nudged him towards the twilight of his life, he found himself packing up his genius and heading north to France. Picture it. One of the greatest minds of the Renaissance, not strutting into the Louvre as a conquering hero, but rather crossing the Alps with a few paintings, a heart full of ambition, and a head undoubtedly swirling with ideas that would make even the most caffeinated dreamer dizzy. It was 1516, and Leonardo was answering the call of King Francis I, a young monarch who was more Renaissance fanboy than ruler, eager to add a touch of Da Vinci flair to his court. "I'll have what he's having." The king granted Leonardo the title of Premier Painter and Engineer and Architect to the king, which sounds like a mouthful, but essentially meant Leonardo could play with whatever artistic or scientific toys his heart desired. Francis I was no ordinary king. He was the kind of patron who saw the glint of genius in Leonardo's eyes and thought, without the pesky interference of looming deadlines or bean-counting bureaucrats, this was more than a job. It was a carte blanche to tinker, dream, and create. Leonardo set up shop at the Château du Clos-Lucé, a stone's throw from the king's residence in Amboise. The proximity was no accident. Francis wanted his genius within arm's reach, like a Renaissance-era Google search away from inspiration. However, let's not romanticize this too much. Leonardo was in his 60s, and while the king's offer was a golden ticket, the reality was a body that was starting to lag behind a mind still sprinting marathons. His right hand, once deft with brush and quill, was suffering from paralysis, a cruel twist of fate for a man whose identity was so entwined with his craft. But let's talk about the pièce de résistance of Leonardo's portfolio, the Mona Lisa. Before this painting became the superstar of the Louvre, it was just another portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife, Lisa Gherardini. Leonardo began this work in 1503, and like many things in his life, it was a slow burn. He tinkered with it for years, perhaps out of perfectionism, or maybe because he knew something was special about this one. Either way, the Mona Lisa traveled with him to France, where it eventually became part of the king's collection. Today, it's the most famous smile in art history, but back then, it was just another painting in Leonardo's ever-growing portfolio. Now, let's bust a myth. That famous smile was not the result of some mysterious muse or secret love affair. It was the result of Leonardo's obsessive study of anatomy and optics, his understanding of how the human eye perceives light and shadow. He used a technique called sfumato, a fancy term for making things look as blurry as your vision after too many glasses of wine, to create that ethereal, enigmatic expression. It's less about who Lisa was and more about how Leonardo saw the world. Yet, despite all this brilliance, Leonardo's time in France wasn't just a leisurely stroll through the meadows of creativity. Working in a foreign court came with its own set of challenges. Language barriers, cultural differences, and the ever-present pressure to produce something worthy of a king's admiration. Plus, being away from his beloved Italy meant he was cut off from the familiar artistic circles and intellectual debates that had fueled his earlier work. Imagine trying to paint a masterpiece while your social network is on the fritz. Frustrating, doesn't even begin to cover it. So, did Leonardo ever feel like he reached his full potential? The short answer is probably not. He was a man perpetually in pursuit of the next big idea, the next breakthrough, the next Mona Lisa. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind still teeming with questions and sketches, from plans for a new hydraulic saw to musings on the movement of water. Even in his later years, Leonardo was the epitome of restless genius, always on the brink of discovery, even if his body was starting to tap out. Economically speaking, his move to France was a savvy one. Italian politics were as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm, and securing a patron like Francis I was akin to finding a golden parachute in the chaotic skies of European courts. The king's generous salary, and the freedom to explore his interests without financial strain, was a rare luxury that not even the Medici could consistently promise. As we wrap up this chapter of Leonardo's storied life, it's clear that his years in France were a complex blend of triumph and missed opportunities. He was a man who had seen and done much, yet always felt there was more to uncover, more to invent. Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance man, never stopped questioning, never stopped dreaming, and never stopped creating. His legacy was not just in the masterpieces he left behind, but in the insatiable curiosity that drove him to explore the limits of human potential. And though his story doesn't end here, we leave him in France, a man whose life's work was as much about the questions he asked as the answers he found. Stay tuned as we unravel more of this incredible journey, where the line between art and science continues to blur, and the spirit of innovation never rests. So, here we are, at the tail end of Leonardo da Vinci's journey, a life so packed with brilliance, it's like trying to fit the Sistine Chapel in your back pocket. But let's not get too misty-eyed about our favorite Renaissance polymath just yet. It's time to wrap up with a bow made of historical facts and a sprinkle of myth-busting glitter. Let's start by addressing the well-worn myth of Leonardo as this lone wolf genius, toiling away in some candlelit basement, conjuring brilliance out of thin air. While it's a romantic notion, the truth is a bit less poetic and way more collaborative. Sure, Leonardo was a genius, but he was also a man of his time, surrounded by a vibrant network of thinkers, craftsmen, and patrons. His workshops were bustling hubs where ideas were exchanged like gossip at a royal court. Leonardo's notebooks, those sprawling tomes of creativity, didn't just spring from his mind fully formed. They were the culmination of collaboration, debate, and sometimes a healthy dose of borrowing ideas from his peers. Let's give credit where it's due. Leonardo was a master at remixing the best hits of the Renaissance. Now, about those endless sketchbooks, over 13,000 pages of them to be precise. They're not just dusty relics of a bygone era. They're blueprints for the future. These notebooks are the ultimate testament to Leonardo's insatiable curiosity. They're filled with everything from anatomical studies to designs for machines that wouldn't become reality for another 400 years. He was sketching helicopters before the Wright brothers even had a glimmer in their eye, and dreaming up scuba gear while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to float. These pages are like a Renaissance grab bag of ideas, where each scribble could spark a revolution in its own right. Leonardo's legacy, then, is less about the finished products and more about the questions he asked. Today's inventors, artists, and dreamers stand on the shoulders of this giant, propelled forward by the same spirit of exploration that drove Leonardo to dissect cadavers and doodle flying machines. He didn't just leave behind masterpieces, he left a mindset. The audacity to dream big, fail spectacularly, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Let's also take a moment to reflect on the economic realities that fueled Leonardo's journey. His career was as much shaped by the whims of wealthy patrons as by his own genius. In Florence and Milan, it was the Medici and Sforza families who bankrolled his ambitious projects, while in France, it was Francis I who gave him the freedom to explore his passions without financial constraints. Leonardo wasn't just a creator. He was a savvy negotiator, navigating the complex web of Renaissance politics and economics to secure the resources he needed. In a world where art and science were inextricably linked to the purse strings of the powerful, Leonardo's ability to secure patronage was as much a testament to his skill as a diplomat as it was to his talent as an artist. But let's not get too bogged down in the practicalities. Leonardo's story is also one of inspiration, a reminder that sometimes it's the journey, not the destination, that truly matters. His life was a series of experiments, some wildly successful, others spectacularly flawed, but all driven by an unrelenting curiosity. He reminds us that failure is not the end, but merely a stepping stone on the path to discovery. In a world obsessed with results, Leonardo's story is a refreshing reminder that sometimes the process is where the real magic happens. So, what's the takeaway from Leonardo's extraordinary life? Perhaps it's this: greatness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's forged in the crucible of collaboration, fueled by curiosity and sustained by a relentless pursuit of knowledge. Leonardo da Vinci was not an island. He was a bridge between the known and the unknown, a visionary who dared to imagine a world beyond the confines of his time. His legacy is a testament to the power of imagination, a call to future generations to keep asking questions, keep dreaming, and never stop exploring. As we close the book on Leonardo da Vinci, we find a man whose life was as complex and multifaceted as his art. He was a painter, a scientist, an engineer, and above all, a dreamer. His story is not just a chapter in history, but a timeless reminder of the potential that lies within each of us to change the world. Leonardo's legacy endures not because he had all the answers, but because he never stopped seeking them. And in that relentless quest for knowledge, he found something far more enduring than any masterpiece, a place in the pantheon of human achievement where his spirit continues to inspire and ignite the imaginations of those who dare to dream. Picture this: the Mediterranean Sea, a vast playground of azure waves and ancient secrets. Now, imagine a group of people who weren't content with just lounging by its shores, dipping their toes in the water like the rest of us mere mortals might do on a summer's day. Enter the Phoenicians, the ancient world's answer to maritime moguls, who were as comfortable on the open sea as most of us are on our couches. These guys were the original maritime entrepreneurs, the Jeff Bezos of antiquity. But instead of launching rockets, they were launching ships. And boy, did they know how to make a splash. Let's dive into the deep end with a little-known fact. The Phoenicians were the folks who turned purple dye into the ultimate status symbol. We're talking about Tyrian purple, a hue so coveted that wearing it was like strutting around in the ancient equivalent of a designer suit. This wasn't just any color. It was the kind of color that shouted, "I'm important, bow before my regal fashion sense." The irony? This luxurious dye was made from the humble murex snail, which sounds about as glamorous as a day at the DMV. Now, when you think of Phoenicians, think of them as the Starbucks of the ancient world, ubiquitous, successful, and occasionally overpriced. Their trade routes crisscross the Mediterranean like a well-worn blanket, stretching from the Levant all the way to the shores of Spain. They were the original globetrotters, except they didn't have the luxury of frequent flyer miles, just a sturdy ship and a healthy dose of ambition. Speaking of ships, let's talk brass tacks, or rather, bronze nails. Building a ship back then wasn't as simple as putting together a flat pack from IKEA. We're talking about vessels crafted from the finest Lebanese cedar, held together by innovation, sweat, and more than a little cash. A typical Phoenician ship might set you back around 10,000 shekels, a sum that could make even the most reckless sailor think twice. But the payoff? A cargo hold filled with goods that would make any ancient trader drool. From precious metals to wine and olive oil, the Phoenicians knew how to fill a shopping cart, or in this case, a hull to the brim. Now, with such lucrative cargo, you'd think the Phoenicians would have been easy pickings for pirates. But these ancient mariners were no pushovers. They had a knack for navigating the high seas and dodging trouble like a seasoned commuter weaving through rush-hour traffic. Their secret? A combination of cunning, speed, and a little bit of luck. And if all else failed, they were known to pay what we call today a protection fee, a few coins slipped under the table to keep the pirates at bay. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of greasing the wheels, or in this case the oars. Of course, all this talk of piracy brings us to the modern-day headaches of shipping. If you think dealing with supply chain issues today is a nightmare, imagine trying to get your goods safely from Tyre to Carthage without losing half your cargo to the whims of Poseidon or a band of opportunistic sea raiders. It's a reminder that while the players and the stakes may have changed, some challenges remain as persistent as a bad penny. In the grand tapestry of history, the Phoenicians were the threads that wove the Mediterranean into a vibrant economic and cultural hub. They were the unsung pioneers of commerce, the architects of a maritime network that connected civilizations and spread ideas, goods, and colors, especially purple across the ancient world. So next time you spot a splash of purple, give a nod to the Phoenicians, the original masters of the sea and style. And speaking of masters of the sea, let's steer our ship toward the Greeks, those ancient mariners who took naval warfare from a game of cat and mouse to an art form. Picture the Greek trireme, sleek, intimidating, and faster than a caffeinated squirrel. These vessels were the sports cars of the ancient world, packing a punch that could leave an enemy fleet reeling. With 3 tiers of rowers and a bronze-sheathed ram jutting from the prow, a trireme was engineered for speed and impact, a Formula One racer with a battering ram. Now, let's talk about the logistics behind maintaining such a fleet. A trireme wasn't just a floating war machine, it was a floating economy. Each ship required 170 rowers, not to mention a host of skilled craftsmen for its maintenance. Think of it as a small town on water, with everyone pulling their weight, or rather, their oar. The cost of a single trireme? Around a talent of silver, or about 6,000 drachmas. For context, that's a sum that could keep a modest city-state's economy afloat for a year. Now multiply that by the hundreds of ships Athens boasted at its peak, and you start to see why naval supremacy was not just a military endeavor, it was a full-blown economic strategy. The Greek city-states were no strangers to political power plays, and naval supremacy was the ace up the sleeve of any aspiring hegemon. Themistocles, the Athenian statesman, was one of those crafty operators who saw the potential of a strong navy. He famously convinced his fellow Athenians to use the windfall from a silver mine to fund a massive naval expansion. This wasn't just a case of good economic sense, it was a strategic masterstroke. The result? A fleet that would become the backbone of Athenian power. But let's not get swept away by the romance of triremes cutting through the waves like a knife through feta. These ships were less about Homeric heroics and more about cold, hard tactics. The mythological heroes like Odysseus, celebrated for their cunning and bravery, were more public relations legends than historical truth. Real naval warfare was about strategy, coordination, and often sheer numbers. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is a prime example. This was the clash where the Greeks, led by Themistocles, turned the tide against the Persian Empire. In a narrow strait, the Greek fleet outmaneuvered the larger Persian armada, proving that sometimes size doesn't matter as much as smarts. Salamis was more than just a battle. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power. A pivotal moment that set the stage for Western civilization as we know it. The victory at Salamis safeguarded the fledgling democracy of Athens and allowed Greek culture to flourish. If the Persians had won, the cultural landscape of Europe, and by extension the world, might have looked very different. No Socratic debates, no Platonic ideals, no Aristotelian logic, just a lot more Persian bureaucracy and perhaps a few more ziggurats. Of course, the Greeks were not above myth-making themselves. The tales of naval heroes and divine interventions made great stories, but the reality was often messier. For every stirring speech or daring maneuver, there were countless hours of backbreaking labour, political wrangling, and the ever-present threat of mutiny. Maintaining morale aboard a trireme was a constant concern. Imagine being crammed into a wooden hull with 169 other sweaty rowers, all while trying not to get seasick or sunburned. It's enough to make anyone nostalgic for the comforts of dry land. The Battle of Salamis, like many great historical events, was a cocktail of chance, strategy, and sheer grit. It taught the Greeks and the world that naval power wasn't just about having the biggest fleet, but the smartest strategies and the steeliest nerves. The victory at Salamis didn't just save Athens, it gave the Greeks the confidence to challenge the status quo, setting the stage for a cultural renaissance that would echo through the ages. As we let the waves of history carry us forward, keep in mind that the Greeks, much like the Phoenicians before them, knew how to leverage the sea for power, prestige, and prosperity. Their stories, both mythical and real, remind us that while the seas may change, the drive for innovation and influence remains as constant as the tides. So, as we sail onward, remember, in the arena of history, sometimes the biggest myth is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lies a world of hard-won reality. And speaking of driving innovation and influence, it's time to pivot our gaze toward the Romans, those masters of practicality and empire building. If the Greeks were the naval artists with their triremes, then the Romans were the engineers, turning the Mediterranean into their personal aquatic highway system. They weren't content with just riding the waves, they wanted to own them, and they had the cunning to make it happen. Now, let's talk about the Corvus, a name that sounds like it could belong to an ancient Roman gladiator, but was actually a game-changing piece of naval tech. Picture this. A massive wooden boarding device that could be slammed down onto an enemy ship, creating a bridge for Roman soldiers to storm across. It was like the Swiss army knife of ancient warfare. Simple, effective, and deadly. But here's the kicker. While the Corvus helped turn the tide against the Carthaginians during the First Punic War, it wasn't exactly a nautical silver bullet. You see, the Romans weren't born sailors. Their initial ship designs were about as seaworthy as a cardboard canoe in a monsoon. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks and, let's be honest, more than a little from the Carthaginians they eventually defeated. The Roman navy, like much of their empire, was built on pragmatism and adaptation. They weren't afraid to learn from their enemies and turn those lessons into assets. The Romans weren't just about brute force, they were about smart force. But let's not romanticize too much. Despite their eventual dominance, the Romans were far from invincible on the high seas. In fact, their early naval escapades were plagued by disasters that would make even the most daring sailors break out in a cold sweat. Take the Battle of Cape Ignomus in 256 BCE, for instance. Heralded as one of the largest naval battles of the ancient world, it saw nearly 700 ships engaged in a chaotic dance of death on the Mediterranean. The Romans emerged victorious, but not without considerable losses and a hefty dose of luck. Their victory was less about overwhelming prowess and more about sheer determination, and the ability to learn from past blunders. Economics played a massive role in Roman naval expansion. It wasn't just about projecting military power, it was about securing trade routes and the wealth that flowed from them. The Mediterranean, after all, was the Roman Empire's cash cow. Control the sea, and you control the flow of goods, from Egyptian grain to Spanish silver. The Romans understood this well, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. Maintaining a naval fleet was expensive. A single quinquereme, one of their larger warships, could cost upwards of 30,000 denarii. To put that in perspective, that's about 15 times the annual pay of a Roman legionary. Multiply that by a fleet of hundreds, and you've got yourself an economic juggernaut that required constant feeding and care. Yet, for all their strategic brilliance, the Romans were not above the occasional misstep. The myth of Roman invincibility, often perpetuated by Hollywood epics, conveniently glosses over their numerous defeats and setbacks. Their ships were prone to capsizing in storms, often giving Poseidon more than a few Roman mariners to welcome into the deep. And while the Romans were adept at adapting enemy technology, their own innovations sometimes left much to be desired. The corvus, while initially effective, was eventually abandoned because it made their ships dangerously unstable in rough seas. Roman logistics, too, were a far cry from the seamless operations often depicted in movies. Coordinating a vast fleet required a level of organization that even the most seasoned modern bureaucrat would find baffling. Supplies had to be meticulously planned, especially when setting sail for long campaigns. 1,000 hungry sailors could go through provisions faster than you can say, Carthago delenda est. And speaking of Carthage, the Second Punic War was a logistical nightmare that saw Roman fleets stretched thin and resources drained. Hannibal famously took his war elephants over the Alps, but Rome's struggle was just as epic on the seas as they scrambled to counter his every move. Politics, of course, was never far from the Roman naval agenda. Control of the seas was as much about prestige and power as it was about raw military might. The Senate and the people of Rome, SPQR, as they like to brand everything, understood that a strong navy was essential for maintaining the image of Rome as the eternal city, the unassailable heart of a sprawling empire. This was a city that demanded respect and tribute, and what better way to enforce that than with a formidable presence on the waters? Yet, let's not overlook the less glamorous aspects of Roman naval life. Life aboard a Roman galley was no picnic. Imagine being cramped into a wooden hull with 100 other men, rowing in unison to the beat of a drum, the air thick with the smell of sweat and sea salt. Discipline was strict, and punishments for insubordination were swift and brutal. The romance of the sea quickly faded when faced with the harsh realities of life on a Roman warship. In the grand narrative of history, the Romans were masters not just of land, but of sea. They turned maritime dominance into an art form, one that was as much about economic control and political power as it was about military conquest. But beneath the veneer of invincibility lay a history of trial and error, of victories hard won and lessons learned the hard way. So, the next time you watch a Hollywood epic glorifying Roman naval battles, remember that the reality was far rougher, far grittier, and far more human. As we sail onward in this historical journey, keep in mind that the Romans, with their ingenuity and tenacity, laid the groundwork for maritime strategy for centuries to come. While the Greeks gave us the mythic heroes of the sea, the Romans gave us the practical realities of naval warfare, reminding us that in the end, it's not just about the stories we tell, but the truths we uncover beneath the waves. And with that, let's prepare to chart a course further into the depths of history, where the seas continue to ripple with the stories of those who dared to conquer them. Ah, the Vikings, those legendary Norsemen who conjure images of horned helmets, relentless raids, and long ships slicing through the misty fjords like a knife through lutefisk. But before we get too swept away by the Hollywood version of these seafaring warriors, let's dig into the real story, one that's as much about economics and trade as it is about pillaging and plunder. First off, let's tackle the myth of the horned helmets. Sorry to burst your battle-ready bubble, but there's zero evidence that Vikings wore those iconic helmets. It's a creation of 19th century romanticism, more Wagnerian opera than historical fact. In reality, Viking warriors likely donned simple leather or iron headgear, which was far more practical when you're trying to keep your skull intact during a skirmish. Now, onto the longships. Those sleek, dragon-proud vessels that were the Viking equivalent of a Porsche on water. These ships were engineering marvels, with clinker-built hulls made from overlapping planks that gave them flexibility and speed. A typical longship could stretch up to 30 meters and carry about 100 warriors. Fast and versatile, they could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowing the Vikings to strike unexpectedly and vanish just as quickly. But here's the kicker. While the Vikings' raids get all the spotlight, their trade networks were the real undercurrent of their maritime activities. Starting around the late 8th century, these Norse explorers cast a net that stretched from Byzantium in the east to the fringes of North America in the west. That's right, long before Columbus stumbled upon the New World, Viking expeditions led by the likes of Leif Erikson were setting up shop in places like Newfoundland, which they called Vinland. And why did they venture so far? Simple: economics. The Viking Age coincided with a period of burgeoning trade across Europe, and the Norse were nothing if not savvy businessmen. They traded everything from furs and walrus ivory to timber and slaves. The silver dirhams of the Islamic world, the silk of the Byzantines, and the amber of the Baltic were all part of the bustling trade networks that the Vikings tapped into. In this sense, their raids were less about sheer destruction and more about securing valuable resources and expanding their economic influence. Yet, economic incentive wasn't the only driver of Viking raids. Back home in Scandinavia, arable land was scarce, and the harsh climate wasn't exactly conducive to a leisurely agrarian lifestyle. For younger sons of chieftains with no land to inherit, setting sail on a longship offered a path to wealth and notoriety. The raids provided the silver, gold, and slaves needed to cement one's status upon returning home. Think of it as an early form of social mobility, raiding your way to the top. Modern pop culture tends to paint the Vikings as barbaric marauders, storming the shores of England and France with reckless abandon. But this image glosses over the complexity of their society. Viking culture was rich with artistry, craftsmanship, and a legal system that would make a modern lawyer nod in approval. Their sagas and runestones, part history, part epic storytelling, offer a window into a world that was far more nuanced than the caricatures would have us believe. And speaking of nuance, let's not forget the political savvy of these Norse navigators. Viking leaders were skilled negotiators, sometimes opting for treaties and alliances over outright conflict. Take the infamous Dana Guild, for instance, a hefty tribute paid by European kingdoms to stave off Viking attacks. Essentially a medieval protection racket. It was a testament to the Vikings' understanding of leverage and diplomacy. Why raid when you can be paid to stay away? Of course, the glory days of Viking raids couldn't last forever. By the late 11th century, those once feared longships were increasingly met with organized resistance. Viking settlements, such as those in Normandy, began to assimilate, their descendants becoming part of the very societies they once terrorized. The age of the Viking raider gave way to the age of the Viking trader, as these Norsemen transitioned from marauders to merchants. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of maritime history, it's clear that the Vikings were more than the sum of their swords and sails. They were architects of a complex trade network that linked disparate cultures, and their legacy is woven into the very fabric of Europe. The image of the Viking as a relentless raider may endure in popular culture, but the truth is far richer, a tale of commerce, exploration, and adaptation in a world defined by the ebb and flow of the tides. And with that, we'll leave the sturdy longships of the Vikings behind as we venture further into the annals of maritime history, where new stories and new seafaring legends await to be uncovered. As ever, the seas hold their secrets, and it's up to us to dive deep and discover the truths that lie beneath the waves. As we leave the Vikings and their legendary longships in our wake, let's set our sights on a new horizon, the Age of Exploration. This era conjures images of fearless adventurers, majestic tall ships, and maps with a tantalizing label, "Here be dragons." But before you start humming a sea shanty and dreaming of exotic lands, let's steer this narrative ship into the choppy waters of reality. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all about discovering new worlds, it was often about exploiting them. Cue the late 15th century, when Europe was itching for a maritime makeover. Enter Portugal, the little Iberian nation with big seafaring ambitions. They had Prince Henry the Navigator, who, despite rarely setting foot on a ship, was the Elon Musk of his time, minus the tweets. Under his watchful eye, Portuguese sailors began mapping the African coast, fueled by a potent mix of curiosity and a desperate need for a direct spice route. You see, spices were the Bitcoin of the Renaissance, a commodity worth its weight in gold, or in this case, peppercorns. By the late 1400s, the Portuguese had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, bridging Europe to the Indian Ocean. Enter Vasco da Gama in 1498, who sailed all the way to Calicut, India. His journey wasn't exactly a love letter to diplomacy. Upon arrival, he famously complained that the local gifts of gold and jewels weren't up to snuff, which, needless to say, didn't earn him many fans. But despite his social faux pas, da Gama's voyage slashed the cost of spices by cutting out the middlemen, namely, the Ottoman Empire in Venice. Suddenly, Europe's taste buds were tingling, and everyone wanted in on the action. Across the continent, Spain was also itching for its piece of the pie, and they found their golden ticket in Christopher Columbus. Now, here's where things get mythically muddled. Columbus didn't discover. America indigenous peoples had been living there for thousands of years. What he did do was stumble upon the Caribbean in 1492, convinced he'd hit the jackpot in Asia. Talk about a navigation fail of epic proportions. Yet, his voyages sparked a wave of exploration, or rather, exploitation, by European powers eager to claim new lands and resources. The so-called discovery of the Americas unleashed a frenzy of colonial conquest, with Spain and Portugal leading the charge under the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This papal decree divided the non-European world between them, like two kids splitting a candy bar, except the candy was continents, and the wrapper was indigenous sovereignty. The harsh truth? This era wasn't just about brave explorers, it was about brutal colonizers. Take Hernán Cortés, who, with a small army and a lot of local alliances, toppled the mighty Aztec Empire in 1521. His secret weapons? Horses, steel, and smallpox. Not exactly the stuff of romantic epics. Meanwhile, Francisco Pizarro was busy doing a number on the Inca Empire in the 530s, exploiting internal strife and wielding gunpowder like a magic wand of destruction. These conquests weren't just about land, they were about silver and gold, the lifeblood of European economies. By the mid-16th century, Spanish galleons were hauling back tons of precious metals, fueling an inflationary boom that turned Europe into a financial pressure cooker. But before we get too swept away by tales of conquest, let's address the human cost. The age of exploration was a catastrophe for indigenous populations, whose societies were decimated by disease and violence. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of the native population in the Americas perished within a century of European contact. That's a staggering figure, eclipsing any tales of daring explorers with a grim reality of loss and upheaval. And yet, the age also set the stage for global trade networks that would shape the modern world. The Columbian Exchange, named ironically after Columbus, saw crops, animals, and ideas cross oceans like never before. Potatoes and corn from the Americas transformed European and Asian diets, while Old World horses revolutionized indigenous life on the Great Plains. So, while the explorers were busy planting flags, the real legacy was one of cultural and biological exchange, for better or worse. Now, let's talk about the economic underbelly of this golden age. The riches flowing into Europe weren't just lining royal coffers, they were bankrolling a new era of capitalism. The Dutch, with their merchant fleets and financial acumen, became the Wall Street of the 17th century. Their East India Company, founded in 1602, was the world's first multinational corporation, complete with its own army and a business model that would make modern CEOs salivate. Meanwhile, the British were catching on, with the East India Company established in 1600, eager to elbow their way into the spice trade and beyond. But this wasn't just about spices and silks. The darker side of global trade was the transatlantic slave trade, which saw millions of Africans forcibly transported to the Americas to toil in plantations. This brutal and dehumanizing system was an economic engine for European powers, generating immense wealth at unimaginable human cost. By the 18th century, the triangular trade linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas was in full swing, a grim reminder of how progress often sails on the backs of the oppressed. So, as we weigh the legacy of the age of exploration, it's a mixed bag, a cocktail of innovation and exploitation, of new horizons and new horrors. The era set the stage for modern globalization, with all its promises and pitfalls, reminding us that the tides of history are rarely smooth sailing. The explorers may have charted new worlds, but they also redrew the maps of human civilization in ways that still resonate today. As we dock this historical voyage, let's reflect on how ancient maritime cultures, from the Phoenicians to the Vikings, set the stage for this global age. They were the architects of connections, the pioneers of trade networks that would eventually span continents. Yet, as the age of exploration unfolded, the quest for discovery often veered into a quest for domination, a lesson that echoes through the corridors of history. So, what's the takeaway from our journey across the waves? Perhaps it's a reminder that the stories we tell about exploration are as complex as the seas themselves, filled with triumphs and tragedies, with legends and lessons. As we navigate our own modern world, let's remember that history is not just about the past, it's a guide for the future, urging us to sail with wisdom, with empathy, and with a keen eye on the horizon. And with that, our voyage comes to an end, leaving us with the knowledge that while the seas may change, the human spirit of exploration endures, ever seeking new frontiers to explore and understand. Picture this. It's 776 BC in ancient Greece. The hills of Olympia are buzzing, and not just because someone's heard about a new type of goat cheese. We're talking about the birthplace of the Olympic Games, where the ancient version of ESPN was about to kick off. Now, why on earth did the Greeks decide to start this grand tradition of running around in circles and throwing heavy objects? Was it really about promoting peace, or was it just an ancient Instagram flex to show off some serious biceps? Spoiler alert, it's a little bit of both, with a generous sprinkle of political maneuvering and social posturing. Let's set the scene. Ancient Greece wasn't a unified nation like today. It was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own quirks and rivalries. Think of it like a family reunion where everyone's trying to one-up each other. You had the big players like Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, each with its own agenda. But in 776 BC, they all decided to put aside their differences, at least temporarily, for something bigger than themselves, the Olympic Games. And what better place to hold it than Olympia, a site that was practically tailor-made for this kind of event. It was like the Madison Square Garden of the ancient world, minus the hot dogs. The Games were originally a religious festival dedicated to Zeus, the top dog of the Greek pantheon. But let's be real, it wasn't just about worship. The Greeks were savvy, they knew how to mix business with pleasure. To get a sense of their motivation, consider this. City-states saw the Olympics as a chance to strut their stuff, both physically and politically. The Games were like ancient press releases, showcasing prowess and power on an international stage. It was as if every discus throw and chariot race was screaming, "Look at us, we're the real deal." But let's take a step back and look at the motivations behind all this pomp and circumstance. The Greeks loved a good story, and they spun the Olympics as a celebration of peace and unity. Which sounds great, right? Except when you realize that these games were essentially a glorified excuse for showing off. The Olympic truce, which supposedly paused all conflicts, was more myth than reality. Wars didn't exactly stop, they just took a brief coffee break. In truth, the Games were a chance for athletes to flex their muscles, and for city-states to flex their political muscle. It was about proving supremacy, whether through athletic prowess or sheer numbers in attendance. Now, when we talk about the key players, we can't ignore the likes of Sparta and Athens. Sparta, with its militaristic ethos, was like that one friend who takes gym workouts way too seriously. They sent their best warriors, and their victories became a testament to their military might. Athens, on the other hand, was all about culture and intellect, but knew the value of a good athletic showing. They'd send athletes who could not only win, but also recite poetry about winning. Because why not conquer the field and the arts in one go? The Olympics also served as a great equalizer, in a society where women were largely sidelined. Sorry ladies, no ancient gold medals for you. At least men from all walks of life could compete. The Games were a rare opportunity for a nobody to become a somebody, to be immortalized in the annals of history. Theoretically, any free male Greek citizen could participate, from the wealthiest aristocrat to the humblest farmer. It was a chance to rise above social status, if only for a brief, sweat-soaked moment. But let's not forget the economic angle. Hosting the Olympics was a logistical nightmare, kind of like planning a wedding, but with thousands of guests and no Pinterest. City-states had to foot the bill for everything from infrastructure to security. It was a massive investment, but the returns in prestige and influence were worth their weight in gold or olive wreaths, as was the prize at the time. And let's talk about those prizes. An olive wreath might seem underwhelming today, but back then, it was the ultimate symbol of glory, akin to a modern Olympic gold medal. Plus, winners would often receive free meals for life back in their hometowns, a perk that's hard to beat. So, there you have it. The first Olympic Games weren't just about athletic competition. They were a complex tapestry of religion, politics, and social ambition. A festival of peace that was kind of about peace, but also really about showing who had the best warriors, the swiftest runners, and the most impressive pecs. And while the romanticized version of the Games paints a picture of noble sportsmanship, the reality was a bit more pragmatic. It was a spectacle, a show of force, and a carefully crafted piece of ancient PR. But hey, as far as ancient world events go, it sure beats another war. Now that we've set the stage, it's time to dive into the nitty-gritty of those first Olympic Games. Picture this, a mass of sweaty, toga-clad competitors converging on Olympia, each one ready to prove that he's got the fastest sprint, the hardest punch, or the longest jump. Forget the Lycra and Nikes of today. These athletes competed in the buff. Yes, you heard that right. Naked as the day they were born. This wasn't just a practical choice to avoid chafing. It was meant to celebrate the human body's form, a sort of ancient body positivity movement, if you will. Plus, without the distraction of clothing, there was no question of unfair advantages. Everyone was as equal as could be, at least in terms of wardrobe. Now, let's talk events. These games weren't just about who could run the fastest or jump the highest. We're talking about pancration, an event that makes modern mixed martial arts look like a tickling contest. It was a brutal combination of boxing and wrestling, with very few rules. Imagine two men locked in a vicious struggle, each trying not just to win but to survive. Biting and eye gouging were technically prohibited, but with no referee to enforce the rules, you can bet things got a little rough around the edges. Winning pancration wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy and, let's face it, a willingness to bend the rules when the judges weren't looking. And then there was the Stadion Race, a 92-metre sprint that was the blue ribbon event, akin to the 100-metre dash today. It was short, fast, and brutal, no room for error. Building the infrastructure to host these games was no small feat. Olympia wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis with ready-made facilities. It was more like a sleepy little town that suddenly had to become the ancient version of a five-star resort. The stadium, gymnasium, and other structures required significant investment. The cost? Well, let's just say it was in the ballpark of several thousand drachmas, which might not sound like much to us now, but back then, it was a king's ransom. The funding came from a mix of public coffers, wealthy patrons, and city-states, eager to show off their civic pride. Think of it as a giant Kickstarter campaign with a little less transparency and a lot more marble. Now, about that sacred truce. Everyone loves to romanticize. Legend has it that during the month of the Games, all conflicts ceased, allowing athletes and spectators to travel safely to Olympia. Sounds idyllic, doesn't it? But let's not kid ourselves. This was more of a gentleman's agreement than an enforceable law. Sure, major battles might have paused for a brief olive wreath moment, but skirmishes and political intrigue simmered beneath the surface. The truce was about as sacred as a politician's campaign promise. It was respected more often than not, but when push came to shove, sometimes literally, exceptions were made. After all, human nature hasn't changed much over the millennia. Peace is easy to promise and hard to deliver. Economically, the Olympics were a boon for the host city-state. Olympia turned into a bustling marketplace, with vendors selling everything from food and drink to souvenirs and religious trinkets. The influx of visitors meant good business for local merchants, and city-states sponsored athletes in hopes of bringing home glory and, by extension, increased political clout. Winning an event wasn't just a personal victory, it was a city-state's triumph. Victors were celebrated like heroes, cementing their hometowns' reputations as cradles of excellence. But let's not sugarcoat it. These games were as much about politics as they were about athletic prowess. When a city-state's athlete won, it was more than just a personal achievement. It was a declaration of their culture's superiority. You could almost hear the rival city-states grinding their teeth, knowing they'd have to up their game next time. The games were a not-so-subtle reminder of which city-states had the strongest warriors and the deepest pockets. It was the ancient Greek version of a diplomatic power play, where athletic victories translated into political capital. So as we wrap up this part of our journey through the ancient Olympics, keep in mind that behind every noble ideal of peace and athletic excellence, there was a very real, very human struggle for power and prestige. The games were a dazzling spectacle, a celebration of the human spirit, sure, but they were also a reflection of the political machinations and economic realities of the time. Next, we'll dive into the aftermath of these games and how they evolved over time, leaving a legacy that still resonates today. But for now, let's just appreciate the fact that the ancient Greeks, for all their quirks and contradictions, managed to create a tradition that's endured for millennia, warts and all. As the dust settled on the track and the cheers faded into the ether, it was time to dive into what lay beneath the pomp and pageantry of the Olympic Games. Let's face it, ancient Greece didn't just throw a killer sporting event for the sake of athletics alone. Oh no, this was as much about divine intervention as it was about human competition. While today's athletes might thank their lucky stars or credit a rigorous training regime, the ancient Greeks had a slightly different approach. They were all about keeping Zeus and the gang happy. Zeus, the head honcho of Mount Olympus, wasn't just a passive spectator sipping ambrosia on his cloud-cushioned recliner. The games were dedicated to him after all. They kicked off with elaborate sacrifices to ensure the gods were on board with the whole affair. Picture this. Priests meticulously preparing oxen for sacrifice, the air thick with the scent of burnt offerings as athletes prayed for favor from above. And if you think the gods were indifferent to javelin throws or chariot races, think again. According to the Greeks, every discus that flew and every race won was under the watchful eye of Zeus himself. But let's take a step back and ask the real question here. Did Zeus or any of the gods actually care who won the long jump? Well, that's debatable. The Greeks were masters at blending religion with showmanship, creating a spectacle that was as much about appeasing the gods as it was about flaunting human prowess. The line between piety and performance was as thin as a Spartan's patience. In reality, these rituals were as much about politics and public relations as divine favor. Sacrifices were grand displays, meant to impress both the gods and the crowds gathered to witness the games. Primary sources like the writings of Pausanias, the Greek traveller and geographer, paint a vivid picture of the religious undertones. He documented the grandeur of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, where a massive statue of the god sat resplendent in gold and ivory, crafted by the legendary sculptor Phidias. This wasn't just any statue. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a testament to the lengths the Greeks would go to in order to honor their deities. But as grand as these tributes were, they also served a more mundane purpose, reinforcing the social and political order. The Greeks recorded these events with a flair for the dramatic, often omitting the less savory details. Sure, the sacrifices and ceremonies were meticulously documented, but the not-so-noble side, a dash of bribery here, a sprinkle of political machination there, tended to be swept under the proverbial rug. After all, who wants to tarnish a good myth with reality? Yet, the truth is, the games were as much about human ambition as divine approval. And then there's the blend of religion and commerce that can't be ignored. The financial implications of hosting such a massive event were significant, and the gods played a convenient role in justifying the expense. By couching the games in religious terms, city-states could funnel resources into the event under the guise of piety. The economic boost from pilgrims and spectators was a divine bonus, but make no mistake, this was as calculated as any modern business venture. The Greeks had a knack for using religion to grease the wheels of politics and commerce, and the Olympics were no exception. The Games provided a stage for city-states to flaunt their wealth and piety, drawing visitors from across the Greek world. This influx of people meant money flowed like wine at a symposium, benefiting everyone from the priests to the local tavern owners. It was a symbiotic relationship, with each party playing their part in the grand theatre of the Games. So, while the athletes toiled under the sun, hoping for a nod from Zeus, the real action was as much behind the scenes as it was on the field. The Games were a masterclass in ancient marketing, a showcase of the intricate dance between religion, politics, and economics that defined Greek society. And in this grand tapestry, but gods were more than just celestial spectators. They were essential players in a game that transcended the physical contests played out on the dusty fields of Olympia. As we unravel the threads of this ancient spectacle, it becomes clear that the Olympics were a brilliant confluence of the sacred and the secular. They were an extravagant blend of faith and festivity, where athletes competed not just for personal glory, but for the honor of their city-states and, supposedly, the favor of the gods. But whether or not the divine were genuinely invested in who crossed the finish line first, well, that's a matter of interpretation. The important thing is that the Greeks believed they were, and that belief shaped the games as we know them. In the end, the Olympic Games were about more than just sport. They were a reflection of a society that understood the power of spectacle, the importance of myth, and the intricate dance of power and piety. They were a microcosm of ancient Greek life, where every race and ritual held a deeper meaning, echoing the complex interplay of human ambition and divine will. And as we continue to explore this fascinating world, remember that every story, every legend, has two sides, the myth and the reality. The Olympics were no exception, and their legacy is a testament to the enduring power of both. And so, as the Greeks spun tales of divine favor and earthly prowess, the Olympic Games became a mirror reflecting the ever-changing landscape of the ancient world. Fast forward a few centuries, and boy, did things get interesting. The humble beginnings in 776 BC evolved into something far more complex, like a reality show that just couldn't resist adding a few plot twists. Let's kick things off with the events themselves. Originally, the Olympics had a pretty straightforward lineup: running, jumping, wrestling, and of course, pancration, because nothing says, "I'm a civilized society," like a no-holds-barred brawl. But as time marched on, the Greeks decided to spice things up. By the 5th century BC, they'd thrown chariot racing into the mix, which was basically the ancient equivalent of NASCAR, complete with high-speed crashes and a fair share of drama. This wasn't just about speed, it was about strategy, teamwork, and, sometimes, bribery. You see, the wealthy patrons who owned the horses often got the glory, while the charioteers risked life and limb. Talk about a raw deal. Then came the hoplitodromos, where athletes ran in full military gear. Yes, you heard that right, helmets, shields and all. It was as much a test of endurance as it was a recruitment ad for the local army. The Greeks were nothing if not practical, and if you could run fast while weighed down by half a wardrobe, you were pretty much set for battle. But it wasn't just the events that evolved, the very nature of the competition began to shift. Into the rise of professional athletes. By the time we hit the 4th century BC, the Olympic Games had morphed from a festival of amateur competition into a showcase for specialized athletes. These guys were the rock stars of their day, with training regimens that would put a modern gym rat to shame. They had coaches, sponsors, and a fan following that rivaled the most popular gladiators. And like modern athletes, they faced the pressure of sponsorships and the allure of fame. Winning meant more than just a wreath, it meant wealth and status. Now, let's talk politics. Because what's an ancient sporting event without a little political intrigue? As the influence of the Macedonians began to spread under the reign of Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great, the Olympics became a stage for political posturing. When the Macedonians took over, they brought with them a cultural shift. They were less about the democratic ideals of old Greece and more about monarchy and empire building, and they weren't shy about flaunting their power. Alexander himself, though never an Olympic competitor, used the Games as a platform to showcase his empire's dominance, sponsoring events and athletes to ensure Macedonian prowess was on full display. Fast forward to the Roman era, and things got even more complicated. By the time the Romans were running the show, the Olympics had turned into a spectacle of excess. The Romans loved a good show, and they were all about grandeur. They expanded the Games, adding events that catered to their taste for the dramatic. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of Super Bowl halftime shows, but with more toga and less lip-syncing. Here's the kicker. While the Olympics were supposedly a bastion of Greek tradition, the reality was that they became a melting pot of cultures and influences. The Romans, never ones to miss a chance at political theatre, used the Games to assert their power. They might have adopted Greek customs, but they added their twist, emphasizing entertainment over athletic purity. It was less about the athletes and more about the spectacle, the pomp, and the politics. kind of like a modern awards show where the actual awards are secondary to the red carpet moments. But let's not get too misty-eyed about this so-called golden age of the Olympics. While the romantic notion of noble competition endures, the truth is a bit more gritty. The games were rife with corruption, and bribery was as common as olive oil. Athletes were known to accept payouts to throw events, and judges weren't exactly incorruptible. The Olympic ideal of fair play was often overshadowed by the very human desire for wealth and power. Inscriptions from the time reveal fines levied against athletes and city-states for cheating, a testament to the fact that not everyone was playing by the rules. Moreover, participation had its limits. While the games were open to all free Greek men, the reality was that only those with the means could afford the time and training required to compete. It was a rich man's game, and the glory was often reserved for those who could afford it. Women, slaves, and foreigners were sidelined, spectators rather than participants in this grand tradition. So, as we peel back the layers of history, what do we find? A complex tapestry of athleticism and ambition, where the line between myth and reality is as blurred as an ancient marathon runner's vision at the finish line. The Olympics were a microcosm of the societies that hosted them, reflecting the values, conflicts, and contradictions of their times. They were a celebration of human achievement, yes, but also a reminder that even the most revered traditions have their shadows. As we continue to journey through the evolution of these games, let's keep our eyes open to the stories that lie beneath the surface. The myth of the Olympic Games is a powerful one, but it's the reality, the politics, the economics, the humanity, that truly brings the past to life. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this saga, exploring how these ancient games paved the way for the global phenomenon we know today. The story isn't over yet, and the best is yet to come. And now, let's fast forward to the 19th century, a time when the world was just getting over the hangover of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution was cranking out steam engines like it was nobody's business. Enter Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a French aristocrat with a penchant for reviving old traditions and a knack for organizing events that made a splash. Think of him as the Steve Jobs of his time, but instead of iPhones, he was all about breathing life back into the Olympic Games. Now, why would anyone want to resurrect a tradition that had been gathering dust for over a millennium? Well, Coubertin had a vision, or maybe a dream, after one too many glasses of Bordeaux, that the world needed a unifying event, something that could bridge national divides through the universal language of sport. In 1896, in Athens, Greece, where else, his dream became a reality. Cue the fireworks and the global anthem, because the modern Olympics were born. The inaugural modern games were a modest affair compared to today's spectacle. We're talking about 241 athletes from 14 countries, competing in 43 events. A far cry from the 11,000 athletes from 207 countries we saw in Tokyo 2020. But it was a start. A bold statement that the spirit of competition was alive and kicking. And let's not forget, it was as much a political statement as a sporting one. In a world teetering on the brink of the 20th century's tumultuous decades, the Olympics were a beacon of hope. A little like Woodstock, but with fewer guitars and more gymnastics. But, as with any grand revival, the modern Olympics didn't completely escape the shadows of its ancient predecessor. The romantic myths of peace and unity were still peddled like hotcakes, despite the reality that nationalism often turned the games into a geopolitical chessboard. The Berlin Games of 1936, for example, were famously hijacked by Adolf Hitler as a propaganda tool. Nothing screams global harmony, quite like using a sporting event to push an agenda of Aryan supremacy, right? And then there's the commercialism. Oh boy, did the ancient Greeks miss out on this one? They didn't have lucrative sponsorship deals or athletes plastering their faces on cereal boxes. But fast forward to the modern era, and you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry. The IOC's revenue from the Rio 2016 Games alone was a staggering $5.7 billion. For perspective, that's about the GDP of a small island nation. The Games have become a commercial juggernaut, with TV rights, sponsorships, and merchandise sales driving the economic engine. The ancient Greeks might have competed for olive wreaths, but today's athletes can walk away with a pretty penny, not to mention fame and endorsement deals. This brings us to the big question. Does the ancient spirit of the Games still resonate today, or has it been lost in a sea of commercialism and political posturing? Are we still celebrating athletic prowess, Or are we just tuning in for the advertising spectacle and the chance to see our favourite stars rake in medals like it's a Black Friday sale at the local megamart? To be fair, the Olympics still serve as a platform for incredible human feats, a showcase of what the human body and spirit can achieve. Take Usain Bolt's lightning-fast sprints or Simone Biles' gravity-defying flips. These are modern marvels that echo the ancient ideal of celebrating physical excellence. And yet, the Games are more than just sports. They're a stage where the world's issues play out, where athletes become symbols, and where every victory and loss is loaded with meaning beyond the scoreboard. The enduring human fascination with the Olympics stems from this complex interplay of myth and reality. We're drawn to the stories of triumph against the odds, the underdogs who rise to the occasion, and the fleeting moments where the impossible becomes possible. It's the same reason why we're captivated by tales of Achilles and Hercules, humanity's eternal quest to push boundaries and defy limitations, even if only for a moment. So, as the Olympic flame continues to light up stadiums around the world, it's worth pondering what the Games truly represent. Are they a continuation of the ancient Greeks' noble ideals, or have they morphed into something else entirely? The answer, as with most things in history, isn't black and white. It's a tapestry woven from both the myths we cherish and the realities we face, a reminder that while the past may be distant, its echoes still resonate in our modern world. As we wrap up this journey through the history of the Olympic Games, let's take a moment to appreciate the legacy they've left behind. From the dust of Olympia to the global stages of today, they've evolved, adapted, and at times stumbled. Yet, through it all, they've remained a testament to the enduring power of human ambition and the universal appeal of competition. Whether you're a fan of the ancient pancration or a devotee of the modern marathon, the Olympics have a little something for everyone, a legacy as rich and varied as the athletes who compete. And who knows? Maybe someday we'll see a return to the raw, naked glory of the original Games. Until then, we'll just have to settle for Lycra and Nike. Picture this. You're a weary traveller in medieval England, trudging through the muck and mire of the 14th century countryside. Your feet are sore, your stomach's empty, and you're about as cheery as a cat in a rainstorm. Just as you consider laying down in a ditch to call it a day, you spot a beacon of hope, a medieval inn. Now, before you get all excited about a warm bed and a hot meal, let's set the record straight. Comfort in these places was about as relative as a distant cousin twice removed. First off, let's talk about the architectural wonder, or lack thereof, of medieval inns. Built primarily of timber, wattle, and daub, these establishments were more like tinderboxes waiting for an enthusiastic spark. The walls were a charming mix of mud, straw, and whatever else could be scrounged up, creating a structure that was about as sturdy as a house of cards in a stiff breeze. If you were lucky, you might find an inn with stone foundations, but don't hold your breath. As for the roof, it was generally thatched, which, in layman's terms, means water-resistant on a good day and a soggy mess on a bad one. Room sizes were an adventure in personal space, or rather, the lack of it. If you think modern hotel rooms are cramped, you'd better brace yourself. A typical medieval inn room was just big enough to swing a cat, assuming it was a very small cat and you weren't too attached to your elbows. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, so you'd likely be bunking with strangers, their snores a soothing lullaby or an infuriating cacophony, depending on your disposition. Now, let's address the marvels of medieval plumbing. Spoiler alert, there weren't any. Chamber pots were the order of the day, which meant that the concept of sanitation was as distant as the moon. Inns were as fragrant as you'd imagine a place with no plumbing could be. The contents of chamber pots were often tossed out of windows, with the kind of casual disregard that makes you grateful for modern plumbing. So, if you ever find yourself in a time machine back to these days, do yourself a favour and skip the evening stroll. So why endure these discomforts? Well, inns were strategically located along the medieval equivalent of highways, important trade routes and pilgrimage paths. It wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. Distance between inns was calculated with the precision of a medieval GPS, ensuring travellers could avoid the true meaning of stranded. Typically, you'd find an inn every 20 to 30 miles, which was about a day's journey on foot or horseback. If you were on a pilgrimage or trade mission, these inns were your lifeline, the medieval version of a pit stop. But before you romanticize the notion of a medieval road trip, Remember this, the roads themselves were more paths than thoroughfares, often little more than muddy tracks. In bad weather they became quagmires, and in good weather they were dust bowls. The inns offered respite from the elements and the promise of food, which, let's face it, was probably as much of an adventure as the journey itself. Inns were also the social hubs of the medieval world. They were the original social networks, where news and gossip were exchanged faster than you'd say Benedict Cumberbatch. The innkeeper was often a key figure, part host, part bouncer, and part news anchor, making sure that the latest tales were spun with just the right amount of exaggeration. As for the myth of the romantic medieval inn, it's easy to see why it persists. The idea of a cozy tavern with roaring fires and jolly innkeepers is appealing, especially when compared to the harsh realities of medieval travel. But the truth is, these places were practical outposts, offering the bare necessities and little more. They were the medieval equivalent of a layover necessary, sometimes uncomfortable, but essential for the journey ahead. In essence, while the medieval inn may not have offered the lap of luxury, it provided what weary travellers needed most, a roof over their heads and a chance to rest their aching feet. And when you think about it, that's not too far off from what we seek today when we find solace in a good night's sleep, even if our modern beds are far more comfortable. So next time you're tucked in with soft sheets and a memory foam mattress, give a nod to those travellers of yore who made do with far less. Now, let's dive into the bustling beehive of social dynamics inside a medieval inn, where every guest was a walking chapter of human drama. Imagine a mix of characters that would make any reality show producer salivate. You had your weary pilgrims, trudging along with all the enthusiasm of a cat being taken to the vet, each with tales of repentance and redemption that could outlast a sermon. Then there were the merchants, opportunistic fellows whose eyes twinkled at the jingle of coins more than any religious relic. Between these two, you had a whole gamut of travellers, from knights errant to wandering minstrels, each adding their own flavour to this medieval melting pot. Picture these inns as medieval airports. Everyone's coming and going, stories are swapped, and there's always someone trying to sell you something overpriced. Merchants were the medieval equivalent of today's business travellers, always on the go, their lives dictated by trade routes rather than flight paths. They carried with them a small fortune in goods, hawking everything from spices to silks, their wagons the medieval Amazon Prime. And let's not forget the pilgrims, who were essentially the medieval version of tourists, complete with their own set of travel woes and the occasional bout of holies hangovers. Now, the innkeeper. What a character! Imagine someone with the patience of a saint, the negotiation skills of a Wall Street broker, and the brawn of a nightclub bouncer. This person was the ultimate multitasker, juggling different currencies with the flair of a Las Vegas magician. In an era where a penny could buy you a loaf of bread, the innkeeper had to be adept at math, converting currencies from across the known world. And let's not forget the art of diplomacy, keeping the peace among a clientele that was as diverse as a United Nations assembly on a caffeine rush. The innkeeper's ledger was a complicated affair, a testament to the globalized economy of the Middle Ages. You had the English penny, the French livre, and the Florentine florin, all tumbling together in a chaotic dance of commerce. Exchange rates? More like an exercise in creative accounting, as the innkeeper navigated through a financial landscape that would give modern economists a run for their money. It was less about exact science and more about gut instinct, seasoned with a pinch of luck and a dash of shrewdness. But the innkeeper's challenges didn't stop at financial wizardry. No. They were also the enforcers of medieval etiquette, ensuring that guests didn't get too rowdy, a task about as easy as herding cats. Inns were notorious for their brawls, often sparked by too much ale and not enough patience. The innkeeper had to be ever watchful, ready to step in and separate feuding parties before things got out of hand. Think of them as the original peacekeepers, wielding a ladle in one hand and a club in the other, ensuring the inn remained a place of relative peace. Despite the chaos, these inns were vital hubs of information. In a world where news travelled at the speed of a galloping horse, inns were the original Twitter feeds. Travellers brought tales from distant lands, spinning stories that were part fact, part fiction, and entirely captivating. The innkeeper was often the gatekeeper of this information, deciding which tales to spread and which to dismiss as drunken ramblings. In a sense, they were the social media influencers of their day, curating content long before the term existed. Yet, amidst the hustle and bustle, there was a certain allure to these establishments. It was a place where class distinctions blurred, where a knight might share a table with a common farmer, united in their quest for warmth and sustenance. This democratic mix was part of the inn's charm, a place where hierarchies took a back seat to the more pressing matters of survival and camaraderie. In this way, inns were a microcosm of medieval society, reflecting both its divisions and its shared humanity. Of course, the romantic notion of the medieval inn as a cozy, welcoming retreat is a myth that's hard to shake. And who can blame us for clinging to it? The reality was far less glamorous, with drafty rooms and dubious food, but the idea of a warm hearth and friendly faces is a comfort that transcends time. Yet, it's essential to remember that these inns were not the idyllic havens of storybooks. They were gritty, practical outposts where survival trumped comfort, where every guest brought their own brand of chaos, and every night was an adventure. In the end, the medieval inn was a snapshot of its time, part bedlam, part sanctuary, and wholly indispensable. It was a place where the road-weary could find brief respite, where stories were woven and unwoven, and where the innkeeper stood as the linchpin holding it all together. So next time you find yourself checking into a hotel, spare a thought for those medieval travelers and the tumultuous inns that once punctuated their journeys. It might just make you appreciate those little travel-sized toiletries even more. And speaking of those medieval travelers, let's get to the heart of what really mattered after a long day of dodging muddy puddles and medieval highwaymen: food. The medieval inn menu. A culinary adventure where gourmet was as foreign a concept as Wi-Fi. Picture a table spread out with dishes that could either warm your bones or send you running for the nearest chamber pot. You see, the medieval inn's kitchen was less about variety and more about what's available, affordable, or simply edible. The menu was a testament to seasonal scarcity and economic pragmatism. Forget fine dining. This was survival dining. Your typical meal might include pottage, a kind of all-purpose stew that was to medieval cuisine what a Swiss army knife is to camping. It was a mashup of whatever grains, vegetables, and occasional chunks of meat could be found, all boiled together until they surrendered into a vaguely nutritious sludge. If you were lucky, it had some flavor beyond overcooked turnip. Speaking of meat, let's not get carried away with visions of succulent roasts and juicy steaks. The average inn's meat offerings were more likely to include salted pork, or, for the high rollers, beef. But for the majority, it was more about pigeons, rabbits, and whatever else the local hunter could trap. And let's not forget fish, which was a staple, especially on those numerous religious fasting days when meat was off the menu. Fresh fish was a luxury. Most of the time, it came salted or dried, making it as chewy as an old boot. Bread was a constant companion, the medieval equivalent of a side of fries. But forget about fluffy loaves or artisanal baguettes. Depending on your social standing, bread varied from white for the wealthy to black barley and rye for everyone else. And those pies everyone loves to romanticize. They were more like medieval Tupperware, filled with whatever scraps were available, encased in a crust that was sometimes more about preservation than taste. Now, let's dive into the economics because, in medieval times, food was as much about status as it was about sustenance. Prices fluctuated wildly depending on the season, the harvest, and even wars, because nothing drives up the cost like a good old-fashioned siege. Grain shortages could double the price of bread, turning a simple loaf into a luxury item. And the cost of spices? Forget it. A pinch of saffron could cost as much as a horse, thanks to its exotic origins and labor-intensive harvesting process. For the average Joe, salt was the seasoning of choice, assuming you could afford it. And here's where the myth-busting really kicks in. Those legendary medieval feasts, the stuff of fairy tales and Hollywood spectacles? Mostly myth and marketing. Sure, the nobility threw lavish banquets because nothing says, "Look at me," like a peacock pie, but for the common folk, a feast was more about quantity than quality. Your average medieval feast was less about culinary excellence and more about filling bellies, with entertainment and social bonding as side dishes. Think of it like a medieval potluck, where everyone brought what they could, and no one judged the chef too harshly because, hey, at least it wasn't gruel again. And let's not forget the booze, a crucial component of the medieval diet. Ale was the drink of choice, safer than water and more filling than air. Everyone drank it, from children to monks, because it was brewed and therefore less likely to give you a medieval stomachache of doom. Wine was for the fancy folks, imported from sunnier climes and taxed accordingly. The quality of ale varied as much as the food, with some inns boasting hearty brews, while others served something that could strip paint. Ingredient sourcing was a patchwork affair, heavily reliant on local produce and whatever could be traded for or begged off passing travellers. It was a world before supermarkets, where getting your hands on exotic ingredients was like winning the lottery. The supply chain was unpredictable, vulnerable to everything from bad weather to banditry. So, if the pottage was a bit light on meat, or the bread had more weevils than wheat, well, that was just part of the medieval charm. Despite the hardships, there's something almost admirable about the resourcefulness required to keep a medieval inn's kitchen running. It was a culinary tightrope walk, balancing what was available with what was edible, all while keeping costs down and bellies full. The innkeeper, a culinary conductor of sorts, orchestrated this chaotic symphony, ensuring that the guests left with stomachs as full as their wallets allowed. In conclusion, the culinary scene at a medieval inn was a reflection of its time, pragmatic, resourceful, and occasionally surprising. It was a world where necessity was the mother of invention, where the line between feast and famine was thinner than a slice of turnip. So next time you find yourself complaining about the blandness of your meal, remember that your medieval counterparts were grateful for every bite, even if it was just another bowl of pottage. Stay tuned, because as we continue this journey through the medieval inn, we'll explore more of its gritty realities and legendary tales. And speaking of those medieval travellers, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the inn's modest meals were long devoured, the evening entertainment kicked off, turning these rustic roadhouses into hives of social activity. Let's face it, after a day of dodging puddles and praying your horse had enough stamina to outrun a band of particularly enterprising highwaymen, a bit of merriment was as essential as a hot meal. Now, forget any notions of refined theatre performances or symphony orchestras. Entertainment in a medieval inn was more like the medieval Netflix, a chaotic medley of music, games, and stories that catered to every whim and wallet. And it wasn't just about having fun. These activities were cleverly designed to keep guests entertained, and more importantly for the innkeeper, spending money. Music, for starters, was the lifeblood of medieval social gatherings. Wandering minstrels and troubadours were the rock stars of their day, albeit with fewer groupies and more fleas. They'd strum lutes or pluck harps, singing tales of chivalry and romance that might have been as historically accurate as a Hollywood blockbuster. Their songs were the medieval version of pop hits, catchy, repetitive, and great for drowning out the sound of your neighbor's snores. Games, too, were a staple of the medieval inexperience. But before you imagine a round of charades or a friendly game of chess, let's consider the medieval mindset. Dice games like Hazard were all the rage, the medieval equivalent of a Las Vegas craps table. The stakes varied from coins to personal possessions, and for some poor souls, a particularly bad roll meant losing more than their shirt. And while chess did make an appearance, it was a game reserved for those who could afford to think strategically, not just financially. For most, it was a more pedestrian affair, with board games like Nine Men's Morris or Fox and Geese being the evening's entertainment. Storytelling was another crowd pleaser, with tales spun by both practiced bards and those who simply couldn't resist the allure of an audience. These stories range from the epic to the absurd, featuring local legends, historical events, and enough embellishment to make a fisherman's tale look modest. The best storytellers could hold a room's attention with a flick of their hand and a glint in their eye, making them as much a draw as any minstrel. But let's not forget the darker side of entertainment, where the line between amusement and mischief was as thin as a pilgrim's hair shirt. Brawls were common, often sparked by too much ale and not enough patience with a neighbour's boasts. These scuffles were the impromptu entertainment no one asked for but everyone watched, with the innkeeper often stepping in to play referee, club in hand, ready to restore order. All this entertainment was more than just a way to pass the time. It was a reflection of the larger social and political climate of the time, a microcosm of medieval society itself. Inns were the original social networks, where news travelled faster than a courier's horse. The stories and songs shared within their walls were a mix of fact and fiction, shaping public opinion and spreading tales of far-off lands and local gossip alike. Economically, the innkeeper was a shrewd operator, understanding that a guest who stayed for the entertainment was a guest who spent more money. The more musicians, storytellers, and games available, the more ale was consumed and the more coins clinked into the innkeeper's purse. It was a delicate balance, providing just enough excitement to keep guests engaged without letting things spiral into chaos. A medieval version of crowd control. In this lively atmosphere, hierarchies blurred and social norms took a back seat to the more pressing matters of enjoyment and survival. A knight could find himself sharing a laugh with a peasant, while merchants might exchange tales of distant lands with pilgrims. It was a melting pot of medieval society, where the only currency that mattered was the ability to entertain or be entertained. Yet, amidst the revelry and camaraderie, there lingered the ever-present spectre of reality. The songs and stories that captivated audiences were often escapism, a way to forget the harshness of life outside those timber and daub walls. In a world where famine, war, and disease were constant threats, the inn offered a brief respite, a chance to laugh, gamble, and lose oneself in the moment. So, while the romantic vision of a medieval inn as a haven of merriment endures, it's crucial to remember that behind the music and laughter was a gritty reality. These were places of necessity rather than luxury, where entertainment was both a balm for weary travelers and a business for savvy innkeepers. The allure lay in their ability to provide a slice of normalcy amidst the chaos of medieval life, a place where stories were spun, dice were tossed, and music played on, echoing the chaotic yet resilient spirit of the times. And just when you think you've got a handle on the medieval inn experience, remember that we've only scratched the surface. There's still more to explore in this captivating world of medieval hospitality. Stay tuned, because next up, we'll delve into the intriguing interplay of politics and power within these lively establishments, where the fate of nations could be swayed over a pint of ale. As we wade further into the murky waters of medieval inns, it's time to unravel the web of politics and power that stretched across these humble establishments. Picture an inn as a medieval think tank, minus the PowerPoint presentations and catered lunches. Here, the fate of nations could be nudged over a pint of ale, and alliances forged in the flickering light of a smoky hearth. Inns were the unofficial headquarters of medieval diplomacy, where the line between host and hostage was sometimes as thin as the ale they served. Now, why were these dingy, drafty places so important? It's all about location, my dear Watson. Inns were strategically placed along the trade routes that crisscrossed Europe like a spider's web. They were the medieval equivalent of highway rest stops, but instead of fast food and souvenir mugs, they offered a place for traders, messengers, and nobles to rest and, more importantly, talk. Imagine a bustling network of information exchange, where the latest gossip about the king's new tax was as valuable as a shipment of silk from the east. In an era when news travelled at the speed of a horse-drawn cart, inns were critical nodes in the communication network. They were the medieval version of a tweet gone viral, with news spreading from traveller to traveller, each adding their own flair to the tale. This was a time when a whispered word could topple a king or start a war, and inns were the perfect breeding ground for such whispers. The innkeeper, with an ear to the ground and a finger in every pie, held a position of no small significance. They were the original influencers, curating the news and often deciding what was worth spreading. Let's talk money, because what's politics without a little fiscal intrigue? Inns were both the ATM and the stock market of medieval society. They facilitated trade by providing a place for merchants to meet, haggle, and seal deals over a mug of questionable ale. The exchange of goods wasn't just about the physical items, but also the exchange of ideas and culture. Think of it as a medieval TED Talk, but with more shouting and fewer slides. Economically speaking, inns were powerhouses. They created jobs, from the lowliest pot scrubber to the savvy innkeeper. In England, for example, the 14th century saw a boom in commerce, thanks in part to these bustling outposts. Inns were the backbone of the local economy, supporting farmers, brewers, butchers, and a host of other tradespeople. They were the medieval version of a small business hub, and their impact was felt far beyond their smoke-blackened walls. But let's not buy into the myth that these inns were bustling centres of egalitarian society. In reality, they were just as hierarchical as the feudal system itself. While anyone could theoretically walk through the door, what awaited you inside often depended on who you were. Nobles received the finest accommodations, while the common folk made do with whatever corner they could find. It was a microcosm of the outside world, where class dictated comfort and access. Despite this, the inn's role in shaping medieval commerce and culture is undeniable. They were the unsung heroes of the medieval age, the glue that held the patchwork of society together. Without them, trade would have stalled, news would have travelled at a snail's pace, and the social fabric of the time would have been a lot less colourful. Now, before you get carried away thinking of medieval inns as some sort of rustic utopia, let's come back down to earth. These were practical places, driven by necessity rather than any altruistic ideal. They thrived on the simple premise of supply and demand. Travellers needed food, shelter, and company, and inns provided it, at a price. They were a business, plain and simple, with all the shrewdness and cutthroat tactics that come with the territory. So, what legacy did these medieval waypoints leave for us modern wanderers? Well, take a look at the hotel industry today. The bones of those ancient inns are still visible in the structure of modern hospitality. The concept of a roadside inn has evolved into everything from luxury resorts to budget motels, but the core idea remains: a place to rest, regroup, and recharge. When you check into a hotel today, whether it's a 5-star affair with a lobby that smells of lavender, or a roadside motel with a flickering neon sign, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The idea of hospitality as a business, as a lifeline for travellers, is as relevant now as it was in the days of timber and daub. And let's not forget the cultural impact. The stories and legends born in those smoky rooms continue to inspire us. From Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to modern road trip tales, the spirit of the medieval inn lives on. It's a testament to the enduring human desire for connection, even amidst the chaos of travel. In wrapping up our journey through the medieval inn, it's clear that these places were far more than mere pit stops. They were vibrant, chaotic microcosms of medieval life, where the political, economic, and social threads wove together in a tapestry as rich as any royal robe. They were places of refuge, commerce, and culture, without which the medieval world would have been a far less connected place. So next time you find yourself settling into a hotel room, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those medieval inns. Consider the travellers who came before you, seeking warmth and shelter in a world far harsher than our own. And perhaps, just perhaps, raise a glass to the innkeepers of old, those unsung heroes who kept the fires burning and the ale flowing, ensuring that the weary had a place to rest their heads. Cheers to the past and the journey it paved for us all. Alright folks, let's dive into the whirlwind world of Catherine the Great, a woman whose life reads like a blockbuster screenplay, complete with political machinations, an awkward marriage, and a coup d'etat that would make even the most seasoned Game of Thrones character blush. Born in 1729 as Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in the backwoods of Prussia, well, not literally backwoods, but certainly not the bustling metropolis of Berlin, Catherine started life as a relatively obscure princess. Her father was a minor German prince, and her mother, Joanna, had ambitions that could rival any stage mom. Sophie was just a teenager when she was shipped off to Russia to marry the future Tsar, Peter III. Talk about a life upgrade, right? But hold your horses. This wasn't a fairy tale with a happily ever after waiting at the altar, more like an awkward dinner date that never ended. Peter, bless his heart, was a bit of an oddball. Imagine a grown man, soon to be emperor, obsessed with toy soldiers. Not the charming kind that you might find in an old attic, but full-blown military parades with miniature troops. It was like he was permanently stuck in a child's playroom while the empire waited for a leader. According to accounts, Peter once got so carried away with his toys that he made his servants stand as human sentinels while he conducted military drills. You can bet the Russian court was buzzing, and not in a good way. Fast forward to 745, when Sophie, now Catherine, tied the knot with Peter in what was less a marriage and more a geopolitical chess move. The union was meant to cement alliances between Russia and Prussia, but it was as warm as a Siberian winter. Catherine was a smart cookie, though. She quickly realized that her husband was as ineffective in politics as he was infatuated with his toy brigade. While Peter was busy playing army, Catherine got to work. She embraced the Orthodox faith, learned Russian, and charmed the pants off the Russian nobles. Not literally, of course. She was all about winning hearts and minds, and maybe a throne or two. In 1762, Peter finally ascended the throne, but his reign was as short as it was disastrous. His fascination with Prussian culture and military tactics alienated the Russian aristocracy quicker than you can say vodka shots. Imagine trying to impose Prussian customs on a deeply Russian court. It's like trying to sell snow to the Eskimos. The big kicker? Peter decided to withdraw Russia from the 7 Years' War, which, while not the worst idea, was executed with all the finesse of a bull in a china shop. His poor decisions made him about as popular as a tax collector at a birthday party. And then came the coup. In July 1762, Catherine, with the help of her lover Grigory Orlov and his brothers, because nothing says love like a family affair, orchestrated a coup d'etat that booted Peter off the throne. Catherine must have been taking notes from a masterclass in political maneuvering, because she managed to gather support from the military, the clergy, and the nobility. That's like getting Democrats, Republicans, and third-party voters to agree on something, practically unheard of. The day of the coup, Catherine rode to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, all decked out in military regalia. She looked every bit the leader Russia desperately needed, and the people were more than ready to rally behind her. As for Peter, he tried to muster a defense but quickly realized he was about as threatening as a kitten in a thunderstorm. He abdicated without much fuss and was subsequently put under house arrest where, unfortunately, he met an untimely end under suspicious circumstances. But hey, that's Russian politics for you. Catherine's rise to power wasn't just about luck or being in the right place at the right time. She was shrewd, ambitious, and had the uncanny ability to turn adversity into opportunity. Her ascension marked the beginning of a golden age for Russia, but that's a tale for another time. What's important to remember is that behind every great story, there's a reality that's often grittier and more complex than the legends let on. And Catherine's story is no exception. It's a testament to the power of intelligence, ambition, and a little bit of scheming when the situation calls for it. Now that Catherine had the crown firmly perched on her head, she set her sights on transforming Russia from a lumbering, backward giant into a sleek, enlightenment-fueled juggernaut. You see, Catherine wasn't just content to rule, she wanted to revolutionize. Picture this: a German princess turned Russian empress with a penchant for French philosophy and a knack for maneuvering through political minefields. You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. First on her agenda was education. In a land where the literacy rate was lower than a limbo stick at a Caribbean party, Catherine knew she had her work cut out for her. Entered the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens in 1764, the first state-financed higher education institution for women in Russia. It was like Hogwarts for Russian girls, minus the magic wands, but with plenty of Enlightenment ideals. The aim? To cultivate educated women who could contribute to society rather than just sit pretty in crinoline. Catherine believed in the power of the pen, and she was determined to arm her nation with it. By the end of her reign, she had established over 50 institutions, a feat that would make even the most seasoned educational reformers nod in approval. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. While Catherine was busy drafting progressive education policies, she was also dealing with an economy that was more wobbly than a Jenga tower on a windy day. The Russian economy was primarily agrarian, with serfdom as its backbone. Imagine trying to modernize a country while half your population labors under a system that makes medieval Europe look like it had its act together. To make matters worse, inflation was skyrocketing, and the treasury was about as empty as a student's fridge at the end of the semester. Economic challenges weren't just playing out in the imperial ledgers, though. Enter the Pugachev Rebellion of 1775, a peasant uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be the deceased Peter III, Catherine's not-so-dearly departed husband. Pugachev's uprising was like a Molotov cocktail thrown at the Russian status quo, fueled by the grievances of serfs who were fed up with being treated like human livestock. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the Volga region, with Pugachev drawing support from those dreaming of a time when the little guy didn't always get squashed by the big boot of the nobility. Now, Catherine wasn't about to let some pretender undo her hard-won empire. She responded with the kind of iron-fisted resolve that would make even the most authoritarian leaders blush. By the time the dust settled, tens of thousands lay dead, and Pugachev was captured and executed in a display that was as much about reasserting control as it was about sending a message: don't mess with Catherine. It was a harsh reminder that while Catherine was an enlightened ruler, she wasn't all sunshine and Rousseau. She could be as ruthless as she was reform-minded when the situation demanded. But let's pivot to something a bit lighter. If there's one thing Catherine loved more than political power, it was intellectual discourse. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot was the 18th century equivalent of a lively group chat, minus the emojis but full of wit and philosophical banter. Voltaire, the rock star of Enlightenment thinkers, referred to Catherine as the Star of the North, while she affectionately called him her teacher. They exchanged over 15 years' worth of letters, discussing everything from statecraft to the merits of novels. Because even empresses need a good book recommendation now and then. Then there's Denis Diderot, the man behind the Encyclopediae, the era's version of Wikipedia, but with more rigorous fact-checking. Catherine invited him to Russia, and even bought his library to help him out financially, with the condition that he could keep the books until his death. Talk about a savvy investment move. Diderot spent months at Catherine's court, where they debated everything from politics to philosophy. It was like a TED Talk series, but with powdered wigs and candlelight. Catherine's engagement with these thinkers wasn't just about intellectual curiosity. It was a strategic move to align herself and Russia with the cutting-edge ideas of the time. She saw the Enlightenment as a toolkit for reforming her empire, even if she didn't always practice what she preached. The irony of discussing liberty and equality with Voltaire while keeping millions in serfdom wasn't lost on her critics. But Catherine wasn't one to let a little hypocrisy get in the way of progress. She was a master at balancing the ideal with the pragmatic, the visionary with the tangible. And so, Catherine's domestic policies were a patchwork of high ideals and harsh realities, weaving together efforts to modernize education, tackle economic instability, and maintain a tight grip on power. It was a delicate dance, one that required the precision of a ballet and the cunning of a chess master. As she navigated these challenges, Catherine was redefining what it meant to be a ruler in a time of great change, one letter, one reform, one rebellion at a time. But this is just the beginning of her story. As Catherine continued her reign, she would face more trials, more triumphs, and more opportunities to leave her mark on history. Stay tuned, because the saga of Catherine the Great is far from over, and there's plenty more intrigue and enlightenment to unravel. Alright, where were we? Ah yes, Catherine the Great was just getting warmed up on the domestic front. Now let's swivel our gaze to her foreign policy escapades, where she played the international chessboard like a grandmaster on a caffeine high. If you thought Catherine was bold at home, wait until you see her in the global arena. Let's start with the pièce de résistance of her foreign policy triumphs, the annexation of Crimea in 1783. Picture this. Catherine is sitting at the grand chessboard of Europe, eyeing that tantalizing peninsula like it's the last cookie on the plate. Crimea, with its strategic location and access to the Black Sea, was the gateway to both trade and power. It was basically the real estate equivalent of beachfront property, and Catherine was not about to let it slip through her fingers. But hold your horses, because the annexation wasn't just a simple case of Catherine waltzing in and planting a flag. No, it was a complex ballet of diplomacy and military might. She had to outmaneuver the Ottoman Empire, who had been the landlords of Crimea for centuries. The Ottomans were like that grumpy neighbour who never mows their lawn but throws a fit if your dog wanders into their yard. They weren't about to hand over Crimea without a fight. Enter Grigory Potemkin, Catherine's longtime advisor and rumoured lover. Potemkin was more than just a pretty face with a sash. He was a military genius with the charisma of a rock star. He orchestrated the annexation with the flair of a Hollywood director, blending military force with strategic alliances. The 1783 Treaty of Quasic-Kanaka saw the Ottoman Empire reluctantly cede Crimea to Russia, marking a massive victory for Catherine. This was like winning the geopolitical lottery, and Catherine knew it. Now, let's debunk a little myth that seems to cling to the annexation like glitter at a craft fair. There's a persistent rumour that Potemkin erected fake villages along the banks of the Dnieper River to impress Catherine during her grand tour. Known as Potemkin villages, these were supposedly facades designed to dupe Catherine into thinking that Crimea was more prosperous than it was. But historians have largely debunked this tale as more fiction than fact. Sure, Potemkin was a showman, but he didn't need cardboard cutouts to make Crimea shine. The real genius was in transforming the region into a thriving province, with new towns and a burgeoning population. While we're on the subject of Potemkin, Let's talk about Catherine's romantic entanglements, because they were more than just a subplot in her life story. They were strategic alliances in their own right. Catherine had a penchant for surrounding herself with dashing, ambitious men, and it turns out that her bedroom was as much a political arena as her court. Her lovers were often hand-picked for their political acumen and loyalty, serving as advisors, generals, and diplomats. Take Stanisław, August Poniatowski, for example. He wasn't just a romantic fling, he was a Polish nobleman who Catherine helped install as the King of Poland. Their affair was a masterstroke in diplomacy, cementing Russia's influence over Poland-Lithuania. It was like merging a romantic comedy with a spy thriller, charming, dangerous, and undeniably effective. And let's not forget about Grigory Orlov, the handsome officer who helped Catherine stage the coup that secured her the throne. Their relationship was a symphony of passion and power, with Orlov playing a vital role in both her rise and her reign. He was Catherine's right-hand man and, at times, her left-hand one too, if you catch my drift. Love wasn't just in the air, it was in every political maneuver. Catherine's romantic entanglements were a testament to her ability to blend personal desires with political necessities. She knew that in the cutthroat world of international politics, your allies were your lifeline. And if those allies happened to be charming and easy on the eyes, well, that was just a bonus. Now, back to foreign policy. Catherine's ambitions weren't confined to the south. She had her eyes set on expanding Russia's influence across Europe and beyond. Her reign saw a series of military campaigns that expanded Russian territory by some 200,000 square miles. A land grab that would make any empire builder proud. But these campaigns were not without their challenges. Take the Russo-Turkish Wars, for instance. These conflicts were as much about securing trade routes as they were about territorial expansion. The wars were brutal, with battles that saw tens of thousands of soldiers clashing in the dusty plains and choppy waters of Eastern Europe. Yet, despite the bloodshed, Catherine's forces emerged victorious, securing key territories and strengthening Russia's position as a major European power. Of course, no discussion about Catherine's foreign policy would be complete without mentioning the partitions of Poland. Over the course of 3 partitions between 1772 and 795, Poland was sliced up like a pie at a family dinner, with Catherine taking a generous helping for Russia. The partitions were a diplomatic triumph for Catherine, executed in a way that would make even the most seasoned real estate mogul take notes, but let's not romanticize this too much. The partitions were a diplomatic nightmare for Poland, leading to the dissolution of a once great nation. Catherine's role in these events was a stark reminder that while she was capable of enlightened ideas, she was also ruthless in her pursuit of power. She played the Game of Thrones with a deft hand, and she played to win. In the end, Catherine's foreign policy wasn't just about expanding borders. It was about solidifying Russia's place on the world stage. She transformed the Russian Empire into a formidable force, a player in the great power dynamics of Europe. Her reign was a testament to the art of balancing ambition with diplomacy, love with power, and vision with pragmatism. But don't pack up your history books just yet. Catherine's story is far from over, and there's plenty more to unravel. From her cultural endeavours to her complex legacy, there's a rich tapestry of intrigue still to explore. So stick around, because the saga of Catherine the Great is just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. So where were we? Ah yes, Catherine the Great was busy carving her name into the annals of history with a chisel and a big ol' hammer of ambition. But ruling an empire wasn't all wars and treaties. Sometimes you had to throw a little culture into the mix, like tossing a garnish onto a 5-course meal. Welcome to the part of Catherine's legacy where art, architecture, and a dash of Enlightenment sparkle come into play. Picture Russia in the 18th century, a sprawling land of icy winds and onion domes where the Tsar was both monarch and mystic, ruling with an iron fist and little divine right for good measure. Then along comes Catherine, this German empress with a French flair, eager to transform Russia into a beacon of Western culture. It was like Marie Kondo walking into a hoarder's paradise armed with a philosophy book. Let's start with art, shall we? Catherine had an eye for masterpieces, the way some folks have a nose for fine wine. She amassed a collection that would make the Louvre blush. By the end of her reign, the Hermitage Museum housed over 4,000 paintings. That's right, folks, 4,000. It was like the ultimate art heist, only legal and with a royal budget. Catherine's collection included works by the likes of Rembrandt, Raphael, and Titian, turning her palace into an art lover's fever dream. But Catherine wasn't content with just hoarding canvases. She wanted to create. In 1764, she established the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, a school designed to churn out artists with the precision of a Swiss watch. The academy became the epicenter of Russian art education, nurturing talents that would go on to redefine what it meant to be an artist in Mother Russia. Consider it, Catherine's own version of Project Runway, but with more frescoes and fewer fashion faux pas. Then there was architecture. If art was Catherine's passion, architecture was her statement piece. She wanted Saint-Cyr-St. Petersburg to be the envy of Europe, a city that screamed sophistication and whispered power. Enter the Winter Palace, a Baroque behemoth that was as much a symbol of Russian might as it was a residence. Its construction was a financial feat, costing the equivalent of millions in today's dollars, a testament to Catherine's commitment to making a statement. And speaking of statements, let's talk about Catherine's penchant for westernizing Russian society, which was like trying to put a tuxedo on a bear. She invited architects from Italy and France to redesign her cities, transforming them with neoclassical elegance. The result? A Russian landscape dotted with buildings that looked like they had stepped out of a Roman holiday. St. Petersburg became known as the Venice of the North, a city of canals and cathedrals that rivaled its European counterparts in grandeur. But it wasn't all Renaissance paintings and marble columns. Catherine's drive to westernize was as much about politics as it was about aesthetics. By adopting Western culture, she was signaling to Europe that Russia was not just a backwater kingdom, but a player on the international stage. It was cultural diplomacy at its finest, a way to bridge the gap between East and West without firing a single cannonball. Now, let's take a detour into the realm of myth-busting. Because what would a story about Catherine be without a little scandal, right? Enter the infamous horse incident. If you've heard whispers of Catherine's supposed demise involving a horse, let me stop you right there. This tale is about as factual as a unicorn sighting. The legend claims that Catherine met her end due to some, let's say, equestrian misadventures. The reality? She died of a stroke in 1796 in her bed without a hoof in sight. So why did this absurdity stick? Because it's a juicy piece of gossip, and gossip is the bread and butter of human curiosity. The myth was likely cooked up by Catherine's detractors, who found it easier to tarnish her legacy with scandal than to confront the formidable reality of her reign. It's a classic case of historical character assassination, where fiction and fact blur into a salacious narrative that overshadows real achievements. Catherine's actual legacy deserves more than a footnote about a horse. Her patronage of the arts, her architectural innovations, and her cultural reforms were profound. She transformed Russia into a hub of intellectual and artistic activity, a place where the Enlightenment ideals of reason and progress could take root. Her efforts laid the groundwork for a cultural renaissance that would resonate long after her reign ended. So, while the horse tale might tickle the imagination, the truth is far more compelling. Catherine's impact was real, tangible, and enduring. She was a ruler who understood the power of culture as a tool for change, and she wielded it with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. Her legacy is one of complexity, a blend of ambition, intellect, and the occasional touch of ruthlessness. As we continue this journey through the life and times of Catherine the Great, remember that history is often a tapestry of myths and realities. It's a story told by the victors, the vanquished, and everyone in between. And Catherine's story is one that invites us to question, to explore, and to marvel at the interplay between legend and truth. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the saga of this remarkable empress. So, you've come along on this journey through the life of Catherine the Great, and here we are, picking up where we left off, with Catherine's cultural legacy still echoing through the halls of history. But let's pivot, shall we? It's time to dive into the grand finale of Catherine's life, where we weigh her enlightened policies against the harsh reality of autocratic rule. Think of it as the final act of a play, where the curtain closes and we're left pondering the echoes of the performance. Catherine ruled from 1762 to 1790s, a 34-year reign that saw Russia transformed from a lumbering giant into a sophisticated powerhouse. Her policies were a mix of progressive reforms and iron-fisted control. a balancing act that would make any tightrope walker break into a cold sweat. On one hand, she was the poster child for the Enlightenment, embracing ideas of reason, education, and cultural advancement. On the other, she was as autocratic as they come, wielding power with a grip as tight as a Cossack's bear hug. Let's talk about that autocracy. Catherine may have been all about Enlightenment ideals, but she knew when to throw down the gauntlet and tighten the screws. Take serfdom, for example. While she toyed with the idea of emancipating the serfs, she ultimately doubled down on the system, binding millions to the land like human anchors. It was a strategic move, ensuring the loyalty of the nobility who were as fond of serfs as a baker is of flour. This decision was as popular as a snowstorm in April among the lower classes, but it secured her throne in a society where power was synonymous with control. Speaking of control, let's not forget Catherine's knack for navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. Her ability to outmaneuver rivals was legendary, a real-life chess game where the stakes were higher than a Russian winter's snowdrift. She surrounded herself with loyalists, many of whom were her former lovers, ensuring that no one could pull the rug or crown from under her feet. Her court was a hotbed of intrigue, a place where allegiances shifted as quickly as the Russian weather, and one misstep could mean a trip to Siberia. One way, of course. Now, as we step back to evaluate her legacy, let's not ignore the successors who would inherit this complex empire. Catherine's death in 1796 left the throne to her son, Paul I, who was as different from his mother as chalk is from cheese. Paul was less the enlightened despot and more the erratic ruler, whose reign was a whirlwind of reforms and reversals. His policies were like a pendulum, swinging wildly from one extreme to the other, leaving the Russian court dizzy and disoriented. It was as if Catherine's legacy was a carefully arranged symphony, and Paul decided to play jazz instead. Paul's reign was short-lived, however, ending in 1801 with his assassination, a plot that, ironically, echoed the coup that brought Catherine to power. His son, Alexander I, succeeded him, ushering in a new era of Russian history. Alexander was a ruler who seemed to carry the torch of his grandmother's Enlightenment, advocating for social reforms and engaging in the geopolitical chess match of the Napoleonic Wars. Under his rule, Russia emerged as a key player in the defeat of Napoleon, a testament to the enduring influence of Catherine's foreign policies. Catherine's impact wasn't just felt in Russia, though. Her reign had ripple effects across Europe, influencing the balance of power and the spread of Enlightenment ideals. Her correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot wasn't just intellectual banter, it was a strategy to position Russia as a cultural and intellectual leader. Catherine's Russia was a land where the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity were discussed, even if they weren't always practiced. It was a paradox, but then again, so was Catherine. And here's the kicker. Catherine's legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of contradiction. She was the empress who embraced the Enlightenment while clinging to autocracy, the ruler who expanded her empire while maintaining rigid social hierarchies. Her story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's a messy, vibrant canvas of ambition, power, and idealism. Catherine's reign was a dance between progress and pragmatism, a testament to the complexity of human nature. So, as we close the book on Catherine the Great, let's remember her not just as a myth or a legend, but as a real, multifaceted figure. She was a woman who dared to defy the odds, to reshape an empire, and to leave a legacy that would be debated for centuries. Her life was a testament to the power of vision and the art of balancing ideals with realities. In the end, Catherine's story invites us to see history not as a series of events, but as a living narrative that continues to inspire and challenge us. And there you have it, folks. The saga of Catherine the Great, a tale of ambition, intrigue, and legacy. So the next time you hear her name, remember that behind the myths and legends lies a story as complex and compelling as the Empress herself.